The music did not so much stop as it was strangled. A single, discordant shriek from a violin, followed by the heavy, final thud of a cellist slumping against his instrument. For a moment, there was only the sound of the cicadas in the oppressive Alabama heat, their drone filtering through the grand open windows of Blackwood Manor. Then, another sound. A delicate crystal glass slipping from a hand no longer able to hold it, shattering on the marble floor. It was the first note in a symphony of collapse. One by one, with the gentle, almost graceful surrender of puppets whose strings had been cut, the wedding guests began to fall. Men in their finest tailored coats slumped forward into their plates of untouched wedding cake. Women in vibrant silk gowns, adorned with pearls and lace, tilted back in their chairs, their faces frozen in masks of confusion that would soon harden into the rictus of death. The air, thick with the scent of magnolia and roasted meats, grew heavy with a new, metallic odor. The wedding feast of Evangeline Beaumont and Julian Croft, the most anticipated social event of 1852, a union of two of Alabama's most powerful cotton dynasties, was over. What remained was not a celebration, but a tableau of the macabre. A silent, seated audience of the dead, presiding over a feast that had become their last supper. Amidst this horrifying stillness, only one person remained standing: the bride. Her white dress, a beacon in the dying afternoon light, was pristine. Her veil, thrown back, revealed a face as serene and untroubled as a porcelain doll's. She stood at the head of the great oak table, a solitary living figure in a grand hall of corpses, her eyes sweeping over the devastation she had wrought. There was no panic in her gaze, no remorse, only a profound and chilling quiet. The plantation bride had become a queen, and this was her silent, fallen kingdom. The first whispers of the legend were born in that silence, a story of a curse so potent it would stain the very soil of the land for a century to come. Before the silence, there was the promise of wealth, of power, of a dynasty fortified for generations. Blackwood Manor, the jewel of the Beaumont estate, was a testament to that promise. It stood on a rise overlooking the serpentine Alabama River, its white columns rising like bleached bones against the lush, suffocating green of the countryside. The plantation was a world unto itself, a brutal and efficient engine fueled by the sweat and sorrow of over 200 enslaved souls, their lives spent cultivating the white gold, cotton, that made the Beaumont name synonymous with unimaginable wealth. Patriarch Alastair Beaumont ruled this kingdom with an iron will and a gaze as cold as river stone. He was a man carved from the harsh realities of his time, a man who saw the world not in terms of people, but of assets. His fields were assets. His home was an asset, and his only daughter, Evangeline, was perhaps his most prized asset of all. From the moment of her birth, her path was not her own. She was groomed not to be a woman, but a tool of alliance. Her education, her manners, her startling, ethereal beauty, it was all cultivated for a single purpose: to be wed to a man who could magnify the Beaumont fortune. That man was Julian Croft, the sole heir to the neighboring Croft Plantation, a sprawling empire that, when combined with the Beaumont lands, would create a fiefdom of unparalleled influence. The engagement was announced in the spring, a declaration that echoed through the parlors and drawing rooms of Alabama's elite. It was a perfect match, they all said, a union of equals, a joining of two great houses. But within the shadowed halls of Blackwood Manor, where the air was always still and secrets clung to the damask curtains like dust, the truth was a far more disturbing creature. For the bride-to-be, the promise was not one of a bright future, but of a beautifully decorated cage from which there could be no escape. Evangeline Beaumont was a creature of contrasts. To the outside world, she was the epitome of Southern grace. She moved with a quiet dignity, her voice a soft melody, her smile a rare and precious thing. Her beauty was of a haunting, almost fragile quality, skin like milk glass, hair the color of spun midnight, and eyes a startling shade of violet that seemed to hold ancient sorrows. She was seen as docile, obedient, the perfect daughter for a man like Alastair. But those who looked closer, particularly the enslaved staff who moved like ghosts in the periphery of her life, saw a different Evangeline. They saw the flicker of something cold and hard in those violet eyes when her father spoke of her marriage as a business transaction. They saw the way her hands would clench in the folds of her dress until her knuckles were white. They saw her in the library late at night, not reading poetry or romance, but poring over her father's leather-bound books of botany and chem. Istri, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. There was a hidden world within Evangeline, a landscape of forbidden thoughts and silent rebellions. She found solace not in the company of suitors, but in the solitude of the plantation's overgrown gardens, particularly in the shaded corners where the more interesting plants grew. Belladonna, with its dark, alluring berries. Foxglove, with its elegant, deadly spires. And the oleander bushes, whose lovely pink blossoms belied the poison that flowed through every leaf and stem. She knew their secrets, their properties, their potential. This knowledge was her own, a forbidden power in a life where she had none. While her father saw her as a pawn to be moved across the chessboard of high society, Evangeline was learning the rules of a much darker, more permanent game. The whispers among the slaves were that the young mistress had a shadow in her soul, one that the bright Alabama sun could never quite burn away. They were right. The groom, Julian Croft, was everything a Southern aristocrat was expected to be. He was handsome, with a charming smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was educated, well-traveled, and possessed the easy, confident arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. The Crofts were old money, their wealth as deep and murky as the river that bordered their lands. To the gentry, Julian was a prize. His courtship of Evangeline was a public spectacle of genteel perfection, picnics under ancient oak trees, moonlit rides in a polished carriage, whispered sweet nothings on the veranda. He showered her with gifts, French lace, ropes of pearls, a songbird in a gilded cage. Each gift was a link in a chain, binding her more tightly to a fate she had not chosen. Evangeline accepted them all with the same placid, unreadable expression. She played her part flawlessly, a perfect porcelain doll for her perfect suitor. But again, the silent observers saw the truth. Hetty, the enslaved woman who had been Evangeline's nursemaid and was now her personal attendant, saw the way Julian's hand would linger too long on Evangeline's arm, his grip just a fraction too tight. She saw the flash of irritation in his eyes when Evangeline's attention drifted, a brief, terrifying glimpse of the temper that lurked beneath the charming facade. There were rumors that traveled on the wind from the Croft plantation, dark whispers of Julian's cruelty towards the field hands, of a coldness that ran deeper than his polite manners suggested. One story, never spoken above a whisper, told of a stable boy who had displeased him and had simply vanished. Julian Croft was a man who collected beautiful things, and Evangeline Beaumont was to be his finest acquisition. The songbird in the gilded cage was not just a gift, it was a metaphor. And Evangeline understood with chilling certainty that the cage was meant for her. The wedding was set for October, when the brutal summer heat would relent, giving way to a deceptive autumn mildness. The preparations at Blackwood Manor were a frantic, all-consuming affair. Alastair Beaumont was determined to host an event that would be spoken of for decades, a testament to his wealth and power. Artisans were brought in from as far as New Orleans and Charleston. Bolts of silk and satin were shipped from Europe. The finest crystal and silver were polished until they shone with a blinding luminescence. The guest list was a registry of the most powerful and influential families in the entire South, each one a thread in the intricate web of commerce and cruelty that defined their world. As the day drew nearer, a strange tension settled over Blackwood Manor, a palpable sense of dread that the festive preparations could not disguise. The enslaved workers felt it most acutely. They saw the way their mistress moved through the chaos, a phantom in her own home. She took an unusual, almost clinical interest in the wedding feast preparations. She would spend hours in the kitchens, a place she had previously avoided, observing the cooks, her violet eyes lingering on the spice jars, the vats of wine, the sacks of flour and sugar. She spoke with the head cook about the menu, insisting on certain dishes, particularly a rich, multi-tiered wedding cake flavored with almond, a flavor she had never before expressed a fondness for. Her requests were specific, her questions precise. She asked about the water source, the storage of herbs, the provenance of the mushrooms. To her father, it was a welcome sign of his daughter finally embracing her domestic duties. To Hetty, who watched from the shadows of the bustling kitchen, it was something else entirely. It was the careful, methodical planning of a strategist preparing for battle. The pieces were being moved into place for a final, horrifying checkmate. The legend of Blackwood Manor was not born on Evangeline's wedding day. It was merely given its most horrifying chapter. For generations, the land itself was said to be soured by a deep and abiding sorrow. The Beaumonts had not built the plantation on virgin soil. They had acquired it through a ruthless and bloody transaction, driving out the last remnants of the Muskogee people who had lived there for centuries. It was said that a tribal elder, a woman of great power, had laid a curse upon the land as her people were forced toward the Trail of Tears. She swore that the river would one day claim the Beaumonts' joy, that any union celebrated on that stolen ground would be consecrated not with wine but with blood, and that the house built on their sacred places would become a tomb for the family's descendants. Over the years, the curse seemed to manifest in subtle, tragic ways. A string of stillborn sons, a fire that consumed the original manor house, a mysterious fever that had claimed Evangeline's mother when she was just a child, leaving her to be raised by her cold, calculating father. The local folklore was rich with macabre tales of the Beaumonts. They said that on still nights, you could hear the faint sound of chanting from the ancient burial mound that Alastair had callously leveled to expand his cotton fields. They whispered of a spectral woman who walked the riverbank, weeping for her lost children. For Evangeline, these stories were not mere superstitions. They were the very atmosphere she breathed. She had grown up with the weight of this cursed history, feeling it in the cold spots of the manor, seeing it in the mournful gaze of the cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. She did not see the curse as a threat, but as an inheritance, a dark and ancient power flowing through the soil, into the roots of the plants in her garden, and ultimately into her own veins. It was a forbidden legacy, and she was about to become its most faithful priestess. The days leading up to the wedding were marked by a series of small, disturbing omens, moments that, in hindsight, seemed like glaring warnings from a fate that was screaming to be heard. A flock of blackbirds descended upon the manor one morning, covering the roof and lawns in a chattering, unsettling shroud before vanishing as quickly as they came. The prize-winning rose bushes that lined the main drive, cultivated for years to be in perfect bloom for the ceremony, suddenly withered and died overnight, their petals turning a sickly, blackish-brown despite the gardener's frantic efforts. During the wedding rehearsal, as Evangeline and Julian stood at the makeshift altar on the grand veranda, a sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the clearing, extinguishing every candle and sending the minister's Bible flying from his hands. The guests shivered, a collective chill running through them that had nothing to do with the temperature. Even Julian, ever composed, seemed unnerved. He looked at Evangeline, perhaps expecting to see fear or concern. Instead, he found her calm, her violet eyes reflecting the turbulent gray sky with an unnerving placidity. It was as if she was not a participant in these events, but a knowing observer of a preordained script. Hetty found the source of her mistress's recent fascination, a small, locked wooden box she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. One evening, Hetty saw the box open. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was not jewelry or romantic keepsakes, but a collection of dried leaves, powdered roots, and several small glass vials containing colorless liquids. Evangeline handled them with the reverence of a jeweler examining precious stones. Hetty's blood ran cold. She recognized the faint, bitter almond smell of crushed oleander seeds. She understood then that the unsettling events were not random acts of a supposed curse. They were the overture, and her mistress was the composer of a horrifying opera yet to come. As the wedding day dawned, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in from the river, blanketing Blackwood Manor in a ghostly white veil. It muffled all sound, creating a dreamlike, almost underwater atmosphere. The festive preparations continued, but they took on a surreal quality, the bright colors of flowers and ribbons muted by the oppressive mist. The mood inside the house was one of high tension. Alastair Beaumont, impatient and irritable, barked orders, his voice sharp and strained. Julian Croft and his family arrived, their cheerful facades doing little to dispel the gloom. Evangeline, however, was an island of perfect calm in the sea of anxiety. Hetty helped her dress in the bridal suite. The gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and French lace, costing more than the lives of 10 of the people who worked the Beaumont fields. As Hetty fastened the dozens of tiny pearl buttons up her back, she could feel no tremor in her mistress's body. Evangeline's skin was cool to the touch, her breathing even and slow. She sat before her vanity, staring at her own reflection as if she were a stranger. "You are beautiful, Miss Evangeline, H." Eddie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Evangeline met her gaze in the mirror, and for a fleeting moment the mask slipped. Hetty saw a flicker of something ancient and sorrowful in those violet eyes, a pain so deep it was terrifying. "Beauty is a fragile cage, Hetty," Evangeline replied, her voice barely audible. "Today, I think I shall open the door." She then picked up a small, ornate perfume atomizer from her vanity. It was a gift from Julian. She gave it a single, deliberate spray, but not onto her wrists or neck. She sprayed it into the air, a fine, almost invisible mist that settled with no discernible scent. Then she turned back to the mirror, and the mask of serene detachment was perfectly back in place. The bride was ready. The story of Blackwood Manor is a forbidden one, a tale whispered in hushed tones for over a century. If you wish to uncover more such buried histories, consider subscribing to our channel, because the secrets we are about to unearth are stained with blood and madness. The ceremony was an ethereal, almost haunting affair. Conducted on the grand front veranda, the guests were seated in rows of white chairs, their faces pale and indistinct in the swirling fog. The minister's voice was a disembodied drone, his words about love, honor, and eternal union seeming hollow and absurd against the backdrop of the eerie mist. Evangeline floated down the aisle on her father's arm, a spectral vision in white. Her face was hidden behind a fine lace veil, rendering her completely unreadable. Julian waited for her, his smile fixed and rigid. He took her hand, and witnesses would later recall that his knuckles were white, his grip like a vice, as if he feared she might dissolve into the fog and disappear. When it came time for the vows, Evangeline's voice was clear and steady, a stark contrast to the nervous tremor in Julian's. She spoke her promises of devotion with a chilling precision, each word perfectly enunciated, yet utterly devoid of emotion. It was less a vow and more a recitation, the performance of a role she had long since memorized. As Julian lifted her veil to kiss her, for the briefest of moments, the fog parted and a single, weak ray of sunlight broke through, illuminating the couple. The guests sighed in relief, taking it as a good omen. But what they saw in that fleeting moment of clarity was far from auspicious. They saw Julian's triumphant, proprietary smile, and they saw the bride's face. Her expression was not one of newlywed bliss. It was one of serene, absolute finality, a look of resolution. As his lips met hers, her eyes were open, staring past him, past the assembled guests, towards the grand dining hall where the feast was laid. The kiss was not a beginning. It was a seal. A final, binding contract on an agreement whose terrible terms only she understood. The performance was nearly over. The main event was about to begin. The wedding feast was laid out in the manor's cavernous ballroom, a chamber designed to inspire awe and envy. Twin fireplaces roared at either end of the hall, casting a warm, dancing light that did little to combat the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The long banquet table groaned under the weight of the extravagant spread. Roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached, glistening hams studded with cloves, towers of shellfish on beds of ice, and silver bowls overflowing with exotic fruits. At the center of it all stood the wedding cake, a magnificent, five-tiered confection of white frosting and delicate sugar flowers. It was a monument to the Beaumont's wealth, a symbol of conspicuous consumption in a land where many went hungry. The guests, their spirits lifted by the flow of champagne and the sheer opulence of their surroundings, shed the unease of the foggy ceremony. Laughter and conversation filled the hall, the sound echoing off the high, frescoed ceilings. Alastair Beaumont was in his element holding court, his chest puffed with pride. Julian Croft, seated beside his new bride, was smugly triumphant, his arm draped possessively around the back of her chair. And Evangeline sat amongst them, a silent, watchful presence. She ate nothing. She drank only water. She responded to questions with a polite nod or a quiet, one-word answer. Her stillness was a stark contrast to the boisterous celebration swirling around her. She watched as the servants, her silent co-conspirators, moved through the room, pouring wine from specific marked decanters. She watched as her father delivered a booming toast to the future of the Beaumont-Croft dynasty. She watched as Julian, with a flourish, took the silver knife to make the first cut into the magnificent wedding cake. Her gaze was methodical, her focus absolute. She was a scientist observing the final, critical stage of a grand and terrible experiment. The poison was a work of art, a masterpiece of botanical malevolence. It was not a single substance, but a carefully crafted cocktail. Ale designed for maximum effect with a delayed theatrical onset. The primary agent was arsenic, the old, reliable inheritance powder, odorless and tasteless, easily dissolved in the wine. It was a slow-acting poison, one that would mimic the symptoms of a sudden, violent cholera, a common enough ailment in the 19th century to potentially confound a cursory examination. But arsenic alone was not enough for Evangeline's purpose. She sought not just death, but a statement. To the arsenic, she added a concentrated extract from the oleander leaves and seeds she had so diligently collected. The oleander would work on the heart, inducing erratic rhythms and ultimate cardiac arrest. It also added a subtle, bitter almond taste, a flavor she had cleverly masked by insisting the magnificent wedding cake be heavily flavored with almond extract. The final ingredient was the most macabre. It was derived from a rare, local fungus she had found growing on decaying trees deep in the swamps behind the manor, a fungus the enslaved workers called the silent breath. It was a powerful paralytic. It wouldn't kill, but it would render its victims immobile, their muscles frozen, while their minds remained horrifyingly aware. The combination was diabolical. The arsenic would induce agonizing cramps and sickness. The oleander would attack the heart. And the paralytic fungus, baked into the cake and dissolved in the wine served to the head table, would ensure that the main players in her tragedy, her father, her new husband, and his family, would be conscious, silent spectators to their own demise. They would be trapped in their own bodies, forced to watch the horrifying spectacle unfold, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to do anything but die. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle, easily missed amidst the revelry. It was a woman's nervous, high-pitched laugh, a sound that ended in a wet, choking cough. Her husband patted her on the back, assuming she had simply swallowed her wine the wrong way. A few moments later, an elderly gentleman at the far end of the table suddenly dropped his fork with a loud clatter. He stared at his hand, a look of profound confusion on his face, as if it no longer belonged to him. Then the music faltered. The violinist, a hired musician from Mobile, swayed on his feet, his bow skittering across the strings in a sickening screech. He clutched at his stomach, his face pale with sweat, before stumbling backward into a curtain. The festive chatter began to die down, replaced by a ripple of nervous murmurs. "Is he drunk?" someone asked. "The heat in this room is stifling," another complained, fanning herself with a napkin. But it was not the heat and it was not the wine. A wave of sickness was moving through the room, an invisible, malevolent tide. Guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Men loosened their collars, their faces turning a blotchy red. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their lips, their eyes wide with a dawning panic. The symptoms were escalating with terrifying speed. Sharp, stabbing pains in the abdomen, waves of nausea, a dizzying vertigo that made the grand ballroom seem to tilt and spin. The initial confusion was rapidly giving way to a primal, contagious fear. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. And as the guests looked to the head of the table for guidance, for reassurance from their powerful host, they found only a new, more profound horror. Alastair Beaumont, Julian Croft, and the entire wedding party sat perfectly still, their eyes wide and staring, their faces locked in expressions of silent, screaming terror. The paralysis was absolute. For Alastair Beaumont, the world had shrunk to the confines of his own skull. He could feel the fire in his gut, the erratic hammering of his heart against his ribs, but he could not move a single muscle. His command to his body to stand, to shout, to do something, was met with a terrifying, silent refusal. He was a prisoner behind his own eyes, forced to watch the chaos erupt in his grand ballroom. His terrified gaze was fixed on his daughter, Evangeline. She sat amidst the silent, frozen figures at the head table, completely untouched. She had not drunk the wine. She had not eaten the cake. She was calmly, deliberately watching him. In her serene violet eyes, he did not see his docile, obedient daughter. He saw his judge, his jury, and his executioner. He saw the culmination of a lifetime of his own cruelty and ambition reflected back at him. The horror of his situation was compounded by this soul-shattering revelation. This was not a random illness, not a tragic accident. This was an act of will, her will. He tried to scream, to warn the others, but the only sound he could make was a faint, pathetic wheezing in his throat. His power, his wealth, his influence, it was all meaningless. He was as helpless as the field hands he had brutalized for years. Julian Croft, seated next to Evangeline, was experiencing the same living nightmare. His smug triumph had dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at his new bride, the beautiful object he thought he had acquired, and saw a monster. Her placid expression seemed to mock his agony. The last thing he would ever see, the last image burned into his conscious but dying mind, was the face of the woman who had promised to love and honor him, watching him die with the detached curiosity of a naturalist observing an insect trapped in amber. The scene descended into abject chaos. The guests who were not yet paralyzed were now in the full, agonizing throes of the poison. The grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor, a stage for opulent celebration only moments before, was transformed into a charnel house. The air filled with the horrifying sounds of human suffering, retching, gasping, the desperate, guttural cries of people whose bodies were betraying them in the most violent way imaginable. People collapsed from their chairs, writhing on the floor, their fine clothes soiled and torn. They crawled over one another, a desperate, dying mass, trying to reach the doors, to escape the invisible enemy that was consuming them from within. But there was no escape. The doors had been quietly barred from the outside by a trusted few among the house slaves, acting on Evangeline's orders. They were not accomplices in the murder, but agents of a grim, dispassionate justice, their faces set like stone as they listened to the screams of the very people who had held them in bondage. Inside, the musicians lay dead or dying amidst their overturned instruments. Servants who had drunk the celebratory wine collapsed alongside the masters they served, a grim equalizer in death. The magnificent feast was overturned, crystal shattering, silver clattering to the floor, the rich food mingling with sickness and despair. Through it all, Evangeline remained seated. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She watched the death throes of Southern society with an unwavering, almost beatific calm. This was not a massacre to her, it was a purification, a cleansing by fire. She was eradicating a sickness, a rot that went far deeper than the people in the room. She was burning down the entire corrupt, brutal world that had created her, and she was doing it from the inside out. Her face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was serene, terrifying, and beautiful. Amidst the cacophony of death, one person moved with purpose, Hetty. She had been instructed by Evangeline to drink nothing, to eat nothing, and to wait in the small alcove by the kitchen doors. Her role in this macabre play was not yet finished. As the last agonizing cries subsided into a final, collective gasp, a horrifying silence fell over the ballroom. It was the silence of a mass grave. Hetty pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The scene before her was apocalyptic. Bodies were everywhere, contorted in the final, agonizing moments of life. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay. She did not look at the faces of the fallen guests. Her eyes went straight to the head of the table, to the frozen, living statues of the Beaumont and Croft families, their wide, terrified eyes tracking her every move. And she looked at her mistress, Evangeline, who now stood and calmly smoothed the front of her pristine white dress. "It is time, Hetty," Evangeline said, her voice the only sound in the hall of the dead. Her command was simple. Hetty moved to the great fireplace at the far end of the room. With a strength born of a lifetime of servitude and suppressed rage, she began to pull away the ornate fire screen. Behind it, laid out in neat, deliberate piles, was a collection of oil-soaked rags and kindling, placed there by Evangeline herself in the preceding days. She took a single, long taper from the mantelpiece, lit it in the roaring fire at the other end of the hall, and walked back, the small flame a defiant beacon in the gloom. The paralyzed patriarchs and their families could only watch, their minds screaming, as Hetty touched the flame to the kindling. The fire caught with a hungry roar. Blackwood Manor, the great monument to their power, was to be their funeral pyre. This was the final, horrifying act of a forbidden story, one that history would try to erase. And for those who are compelled by such dark, erased histories, a subscription to this channel will ensure you never miss these journeys into the abyss. As the flames began to lick up the heavy damask curtains, casting long, monstrous shadows on the walls, Evangeline walked the length of the great banquet table. She moved with the unhurried grace of a hostess bidding her guests farewell. She paused beside the still living, still conscious form of her new husband, Julian. She leaned in close, her face just inches from his, her violet eyes boring into his terrified ones. "You wanted a beautiful bird for your cage," she whispered, her voice a cold, sweet poise. But you never thought to ask if the bird could sing a song of fire." She gave him a small, chilling smile before moving on. Her final stop was before her father. Alastair Beaumont's eyes were bulging, pleading, a torrent of silent curses and desperate bargains raging within his mind. She looked down at the man who had authored her life, the architect of her misery, and felt nothing. No pity, no anger, not even triumph. There was only a vast, empty calm. "You built this house on stolen land and broken bodies," she said, her voice even and clear above the growing roar of the fire. "You traded my life for more acres, more gold. Consider this my dowry. I give you back to the ashes from which all your wealth was born." She reached out and delicately picked a single, perfect sugar flower from the poisoned wedding cake. She held it before his face for a moment, then turned and walked away without a backward glance. She did not run. She did not panic. She walked calmly towards the service entrance at the back of the manor, Hetty following a few steps behind like a loyal shadow. The last the paralyzed men saw of Evangeline Beaumont was the back of her white wedding dress, disappearing into the smoke-filled hallway as the ceiling above them began to groan, preparing to collapse and seal their tomb forever. The fire at Blackwood Manor was a spectacle of apocalyptic grandeur. It raged for 2 days, a colossal pillar of fire and smoke that could be seen for miles. The intense heat, fed by the dry autumn timber and the opulent furnishings within, turned the grand house into a self-consuming furnace. The fog that had shrouded the wedding morning had long since burned away, replaced by a thick, acrid pall of smoke that blotted out the sun. No one dared approach. The field hands and the remaining house slaves had fled to the far corners of the plantation at the first sight of the flames, watching in awe and terror as the symbol of their oppression was devoured by fire. Neighboring plantation owners sent riders, but they could do nothing but watch from a safe distance as the inferno consumed the monument to Beaumont's power. The roof collapsed with a deafening roar on the first night, sending a shower of embers into the sky like a hellish firework display. The white columns, those symbols of antebellum grace, held out until the second day before they cracked and crumbled into dust. When the fire finally exhausted itself, all that remained of Blackwood Manor was a blackened, skeletal ruin, a gaping, smoldering wound on the landscape. The grand ballroom where the wedding feast had taken place was now a pit of ash and charred bone, the heat having been so intense that it had cremated the bodies, mingling the remains of master and guest, man and woman, into an indistinguishable, ghastly powder. The authorities, when they finally arrived to investigate, found a scene of such complete and utter devastation that it defied comprehension. The story they would piece together, the official account, would be one of a tragic accident. A stray ember from a fireplace, a dropped candelabra, a terrible, unfortunate blaze that had claimed the lives of the South's finest citizens. It was a comfortable, sanitized lie. The truth was far too macabre, too unbelievable to be committed to the official record. But what became of the bride? In the chaos of the fire, as the world of Blackwood Manor was consumed by flames, Evangeline and Hetty slipped away into the night. They did not take the roads. They took the hidden paths through the swamp, the routes known only to runaway slaves and the outcasts who lived in the deep, wild places of the Alabama backwoods. Evangeline had shed her beautiful, pristine wedding gown, leaving it folded neatly on the riverbank like a shed skin. Beneath it she wore practical dark clothing. She was no longer the plantation bride. She was a ghost, a myth in the making. Hetty, her loyal confidant and the only other soul to escape the inferno, guided her through the treacherous terrain. They moved by the light of the moon, their only compass the distant, horrifying glow of the burning manor behind them. Legends and folklore are often born from such unexplained disappearances, and the tale of Evangeline Beaumont became one of the most enduring and disturbing in Southern Gothic lore. Some said she was consumed by the swamp, taken by an alligator or sinking into the quicksand, a final act of the land's curse. Others claimed she and Hetty made their way north, using the clandestine network of the Underground Railroad, two women, one white, one black, bound by a terrible secret, vanishing into the free states and a new life under new names. A more fantastical, and perhaps more popular, version of the story claims she never left. They say she became a creature of the swamp, a spectral woman in white who haunts the ruins of her former home. They call her the Ash Bride, a phantom who appears on foggy October nights, her violet eyes burning with a cold fire. She is a warning, a local boogeyman, a story used to frighten children and chasten the arrogant. But all the stories agree on one thing. After that fiery, cataclysmic night, Evangeline Beaumont, the bride who served death at her own wedding feast, was never seen again. She vanished from the world of the living, leaving behind only a horrifying legacy and a smoldering ruin filled with the ashes of her victims. The investigation, such as it was a study in willful ignorance. The sheer scale of the tragedy was overwhelming, and the idea of a deliberate act was too monstrous for the genteel society of the time to contemplate. The local sheriff, a man whose position was owed directly to the patronage of men like Alastair Beaumont, quickly declared the fire an accident. The dozens of deaths were attributed to the fire itself, to smoke inhalation and the crush of the collapsing structure. It was the neatest, simplest explanation. It required no difficult questions. It preserved the dignity of the dead, and more importantly, it did not threaten the fragile social order that relied on the illusion of civility and control. The few dissenting voices were quickly silenced. A young, inexperienced doctor who performed a cursory examination on a few of the more intact bodies recovered from the periphery noted signs of acute gastric distress inconsistent with death by fire. He mentioned the possibility of poison in his initial report. Within a week, that doctor was transferred to a remote outpost on the frontier, his report lost, his career effectively ended. The enslaved people of Blackwood were the only true witnesses, but they were not considered credible. Their accounts, when they dared to speak at all, were dismissed as the superstitious ramblings of an inferior race. They spoke of the mistress's strange behavior, of her knowledge of poisonous plants, of the locked doors, but no one in a position of power would listen. The official history was written by the victors, or in this case, by the peers of the dead. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of fire, not the dangers of a woman pushed to the absolute limit of her endurance. The truth was buried, paved over by a more palatable fiction, just as the Beaumonts had paved over the sacred grounds of the Muskogee. The aftermath sent shockwaves through the Southern aristocracy. The simultaneous death of so many powerful individuals created a vacuum of power and a cascade of legal and financial chaos. Fortunes were thrown into disarray. Dynasties were extinguished in a single night. The Beaumont-Croft Union, which was meant to create an unshakable empire, had instead become the catalyst for its complete annihilation. Lawyers and distant relatives descended like vultures on the smoldering remains of the two estates, fighting over land, assets, and the ownership of the human beings who were considered part of the inheritance. The legal battles would drag on for years, a bitter, greedy epilogue to Evangeline's horrifying magnum opus. The land of Blackwood itself became untouchable, banned by reputation. No one wanted to buy the cursed ground. The fields were left to fallow, the cotton plants choked out by weeds and saw palmetto. The slave quarters, abandoned and empty, slowly rotted and collapsed back into the earth. The ruin of the great house stood for decades, a jagged, blackened monument against the skyline, a place locals avoided, especially after dark. It became a source of macabre fascination, a forbidden landmark. The story of the Blackwood fire was told, but the real, darker version was whispered. It became a ghost story, a piece of local folklore that grew more embellished with each telling. The name Evangeline Beaumont was rarely spoken aloud, as if the very sound of it might conjure her vengeful spirit. In her single, cataclysmic act of rebellion, she had not only destroyed her enemies, she had poisoned their legacy, ensuring that the names Beaumont and Croft would forever be associated not with power and wealth, but with a horrifying, inexplicable tragedy. Her revenge was absolute, extending far beyond the grave. What could drive a woman of her time and station to commit such an unthinkable act of mass murder? The official narrative of a tragic fire conveniently sidestepped this horrifying question. But in the whispers and the folklore that survived, a more complex and disturbing portrait of Evangeline's motive emerges. Was it a simple act of revenge against a domineering father and a cruel suitor? Undoubtedly, that was a powerful component. She was a woman with a brilliant mind and a fierce spirit, trapped in a society that viewed her as little more than a beautiful broodmare and a bargaining chip. Her life was a cage, and the wedding was to be the final locking of the door. The poisoning was her violent, definitive rejection of that fate. It was a horrifying declaration of agency in a world that had granted her none. But the scale of the massacre suggests a motive that went beyond personal revenge. She did not just poison her father and her husband, she poisoned everyone. Every guest, every powerful patriarch and their elegantly dressed wives, every last representative of the society that she so despised. This was not just murder, it was a socio-political statement written in blood and arsenic. She saw them all as complicit, as the smiling, laughing architects and beneficiaries of the brutal system of slavery and patriarchy that had condemned her and hundreds of others to a life of misery. Her victims were not just people, they were symbols. Each dying guest was a pillar of the corrupt temple she was determined to pull down. This transforms her from a simple murderer into something far more complex and terrifying. A revolutionary, a nihilist, a cult leader of one. Her wedding feast was a dark ritual, a human sacrifice intended to cleanse the world of a pestilence. This interpretation is far more chilling, as it paints Evangeline not as a victim who snapped, but as a cold, calculating philosopher who chose mass murder as her medium. To truly understand the darkness that bloomed in Evangeline's heart, one must look at the source of her forbidden knowledge. The library at Blackwood Manor was Alastair Beaumont's pride, but not for the reasons one might think. He did not care for literature or poetry. His collection was one of power, books on law, finance, engineering, and most crucially, agriculture and botany. He owned several comprehensive volumes on herbalism and chemistry, not for medicinal purposes, but for improving crop yields and developing more effective pesticides. It was in these dry, technical manuals that Evangeline found her calling. While other girls her age were learning needlepoint, she was secretly studying the chemical compositions of alkaloids, the lethal dosage of arsenic, and the synergistic effects of combining different toxins. Her father's books became her grimoires, her spellbooks. She learned that the beautiful angel's trumpet growing by the veranda was rich in atropine, that the castor beans in the garden hedge contained the deadly poison ricin. She read about the Borgias and their infamous cantarella, and about historical accounts of political assassinations carried out with a single drop of tasteless poison in a cup of wine. Her education was a secret, self-directed curriculum in the art of death. The plantation itself was her laboratory. She would walk the grounds, not admiring the flowers but cataloging her arsenal. She learned from the enslaved herbalists, the women who kept the old knowledge of roots and leaves, what could cure a fever and what could stop a heart. She would trade them small kindnesses for their secrets, her mind a sponge for this dark, organic chemistry. Her knowledge was her power, her only true possession. And as her wedding day approached, she began to see a grand, terrible application for her unique and horrifying expertise. We are now approaching the final, horrifying hours of Blackwood Manor. The details of the wedding feast itself have been pieced together from fragmented accounts, and what they reveal is almost too disturbing to believe. For those who appreciate these descents into the macabre, hitting the notification bell ensures you won't miss our next exploration of a forgotten nightmare. One of the most persistent and disturbing threads in the Evangeline Beaumont legend is the story of a forbidden love. It's a tale that never made it into any official record, but was passed down for generations among the descendants of the Blackwood slaves. The story goes that Evangeline was not in love with Julian Croft, but with a young man named Thomas, a handsome, literate slave who worked in the stables. He was intelligent and kind, and he saw the woman behind the porcelain mask. Their love was an impossible, dangerous secret, a transgression of the highest order in the rigid, brutal hierarchy of the antebellum South. They would meet in secret, in the deep of night, in the ruins of an old sugar mill on the edge of the property. For Evangeline, Thomas represented everything her world was not: freedom, genuine affection, a life beyond the gilded cage. He was her reason to dream of escape. According to the legend, Julian Croft, in the weeks before the wedding, grew suspicious. His arrogance could not comprehend Evangeline's coldness towards him, and his jealousy festered. One evening he followed her. He discovered her secret meeting with Thomas. What happened next is the subject of grim speculation. The most common version of the story is that Julian, in a fit of sadistic rage, did not confront them directly. Instead, he waited. The next day, Thomas was accused of stealing a silver locket. There was no trial. There was no mercy. Julian, as a guest and future son-in-law of the master, was given the honor of dispensing the punishment. Thomas was whipped to death. In the stable yard, a brutal public spectacle designed as a warning to all but intended for an audience of one. Evangeline was forced by her father to watch. She stood on the veranda, her face pale and emotionless, as the man she loved was murdered before her eyes. She shed no tears. She made no sound. But in that moment of ultimate horror, her grief did not break her. It calcified into something terrible and resolute. Her personal war had just been declared. If the story of Thomas is true, then the wedding feast was not just an act of nihilistic social cleansing. It was an intricately planned revenge fantasy made real. Every detail of the massacre takes on a new, more personal, and even more macabre significance. Julian Croft's death, paralyzed and forced to watch her, was not just a murder. It was a specific, tailored punishment. He had forced her to be a silent, helpless witness to his cruelty, so she forced him to be a silent, helpless witness to his own demise. Her father, Alastair, who had sanctioned the horror and saw the murder of a slave as nothing more than the destruction of property, was given a similar fate. He was made property himself, an object unable to move or act, his life's value reduced to zero. The poison itself becomes symbolic. The bitter almond taste, a flavor meant to evoke celebration in the wedding cake, was the very harbinger of their deaths, a twisting of joy into terror. The paralysis, the silent breath, was a poetic punishment for a society that had silenced her, that had silenced Thomas, that had silenced the hundreds of enslaved people who toiled on their lands. Her victims were not allowed the dignity of a final scream or a last word. They were silenced as they had silenced others. This transforms the massacre from a chaotic slaughter into a horrifyingly precise and symbolic act of justice. Evangeline becomes a dark angel of vengeance, a fury from classical myth cloaked in a white wedding dress. The entire event was a piece of performance art, a gruesome and theatrical masterpiece where every death was a line in a poem, and every silent, staring corpse was a testament to a love that society had deemed forbidden, a love she would honor with an apocalypse. Let us return for a moment to the ballroom, to that final, horrifying tableau, the moment before the fire. Evangeline, the solitary living figure, stands amidst the dead and the dying. Why did she not simply flee? Why the final act of arson? The answer lies in the nature of her ambition. Merely killing her enemies was not enough. She needed to erase them. She needed to destroy not just their bodies, but the very symbols of their power, the legacy they were so proud of. Blackwood Manor was the ultimate symbol. It was the physical manifestation of the Beaumont wealth, a house built on generations of human suffering. Its grand halls had hosted the architects of her misery, its walls had absorbed the secrets and lies of her family, its foundations were sunk into the cursed soil of stolen land. To leave the house standing would be to leave the monument to her oppressors intact. It had to be unmade, returned to ash and smoke. The fire was an act of purification, but it was also an act of erasure. It destroyed the evidence, not just of the poisoning, but of the entire corrupt world she was obliterating. By burning the bodies, she denied them a proper burial, denied their families the ritual of mourning. She reduced them all to anonymous ash, a final, democratic insult. There would be no grand tombstones for Alastair Beaumont or Julian Croft. Their final resting place would be the charred pit of the ballroom, their epitaph the whispered ghost story of the Ash Bride. This final, fiery act reveals the true, terrifying scope of her vision. She was not just an escaped prisoner. She was a scorched-earth revolutionary, determined to leave nothing behind but a legend and a scar on the land. It was the only way to ensure that the story, her story, would be told on her terms. The role of Hetty in this macabre affair is one of quiet, profound significance. She was more than just a servant. She was the keeper of Evangeline's secrets, the silent witness, and ultimately, the sole accomplice. What motivated her to aid in such a monstrous act? It was not the love of a servant for her mistress in the romanticized, paternalistic view of the Old South. It was a bond forged in shared oppression. Hetty had watched Evangeline grow up, had seen the free-spirited child slowly suffocated by her father's ambition and the rigid expectations of her class. But more than that, Hetty had her own history of suffering at the hands of the Beaumonts. She had seen families torn apart on the auction block, had felt the sting of the overseer's lash, had buried her own children in unmarked graves in the slave cemetery. For Hetty, the guests at that wedding feast were not just strangers. They were the faces of her lifelong tormentors. They were the men who dead human lives over brandy and cigars, the women who ordered beatings for minor infractions. When Evangeline came to her, not with an order but with a plan, Hetty saw not a madwoman, but an instrument of a justice she had long since given up on ever seeing. Her assistance was not an act of submission, but an act of profound rebellion. In barring the doors, in lighting the fire, she was an active participant in the destruction of the system that had enslaved her. Her escape with Evangeline was not just an act of self-preservation, it was her emancipation. The two women, from opposite ends of the brutal social spectrum, one white and one black, became sisters in blood and fire, their pact sealed in the ashes of their shared prison. Hetty's story is crucial, for it reminds us that the horrors of Blackwood were not confined to the gilded cage of its mistress, but were a daily, grinding reality for the hundreds of people whose stolen lives powered its opulence. The legend of the Ash Bride is a powerful one, but what is the likelihood of a real, historical basis for this tale? While there is no official record of a mass poisoning at a wedding in 1852 Alabama, the elements of the story resonate with the dark, Gothic realities of the antebellum South. It was a society of extreme contrasts. Incredible wealth built on incredible brutality, genteel manners masking deep-seated violence, and a rigid social order that was constantly threatened by the simmering rage of those it oppressed. Stories of poison were common. For the enslaved who had no access to conventional weapons, knowledge of poisonous plants was a hidden, powerful tool of resistance. There are documented, albeit rare, cases of slaves using poison to strike back at abusive masters or overseers. It was a terrifying threat to the planter class, a form of rebellion that was silent, intimate, and nearly impossible to trace. The story of Evangeline essentially co-opts this narrative of slave resistance and places it in the hands of the master's daughter. It takes the greatest fear of the patriarch, rebellion from within his own household, and literalizes it in the most horrifying way imaginable. The figure of the Southern belle, meant to be the pure, submissive heart of the household, becomes its most potent destroyer. The tale also draws on the very real anxieties of the time regarding female agency. A woman like Evangeline, educated and intelligent but with no rights or power, was a deeply unsettling figure in a patriarchal society. The story serves as a dark cautionary tale, a mythologizing of what happens when a woman's natural submissiveness is perverted into monstrous ambition. While the Wedding Feast Massacre is likely a work of folklore, it is a folklore woven from the authentic threads of fear, oppression, and the ever-present potential for violent retribution that defined the Old South. The physical location of the Blackwood ruins became a source of macabre pilgrimage for decades. Locals and travelers would dare each other to visit the spot, especially on Halloween or the anniversary of the fire. The land remained fallow, the wildness of the swamp slowly reclaiming the ordered cotton fields. The skeletal remains of the manor stood as a stark warning, its blackened stones and empty window frames looking like a skull's eyes. Visitors reported a host of strange, unsettling phenomena. A profound and unnatural coldness, even on the hottest summer days. The distinct scent of wood smoke and magnolias when there was no fire for miles. And most commonly, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes from the shadows of the crumbling walls. The most chilling story concerns a group of surveyors who attempted to chart the land for sale in the early 1900s. They set up camp near the ruins. During the night, they were awakened by what sounded like a woman's soft, mournful singing, seeming to come from the cellar of the ruined house. When they went to investigate, the singing stopped, but they found a single, perfect white wedding dress, made of a fabric that seemed impossibly new, folded neatly on the cellar steps. Terrified, they fled the site, abandoning their equipment. When they returned with the sheriff the next day, the dress was gone. The land was never sold. Nature was allowed to finish the job that Evangeline's fire had started. Today, it is said that no trace of the manor remains. The swamp has completely consumed it, the ground covered in a thick, tangled morass of vines and cypress knees. There is no marker, no plaque, nothing to commemorate the great house or the dozens of souls who perished there. The land keeps its secret, jealously guarding the site of the massacre, a place forever stained by a bride's horrifying, unforgivable act of vengeance. What of the tools of her trade? The knowledge Evangeline possessed was not supernatural, it was scientific, albeit a dark and forbidden science. Arsenic was terrifyingly common in the 19th century. It was a key ingredient in everything from pesticides like Paris green to wallpapers, fabrics, and even cosmetics. A woman of Evangeline's station could have easily procured it under the guise of household or agricultural needs, raising no suspicion. A request for rat poison or a chemical to treat pests on her beloved rose bushes would have been seen as perfectly normal. The oleander was even simpler. It was a common ornamental plant, beloved in southern gardens for its beauty and resilience. Nearly every plantation home would have had oleander bushes growing in its yard. The fact that every part of the plant was lethally toxic was common knowledge, a piece of practical folklore. Children were warned from a young age never to touch its leaves or flowers. Evangeline's genius was not in discovering these poisons, but in her methodical application and her mastery of concealment. The way she used the strong almond flavor of the cake to mask the telltale bitterness of the oleander was a stroke of culinary malevolence. The combination of different toxins to create a complex two-stage effect, one of agonizing sickness, the other of silent paralysis, shows a sophisticated, almost clinical understanding of chemistry and human physiology. She did not need a bubbling cauldron or a witch's incantations. Her laboratory was the garden, her spellbook was her father's botany manual, and her cauldron was the mixing bowl in the plantation kitchen. The banality of the sources of her power makes her actions all the more chilling. The instruments of a horrifying massacre were hidden in plain sight, in the beauty of a flower and the pages of a book. The story of the plantation bride forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. Was Evangeline Beaumont born a monster, a sociopath hiding behind a beautiful facade, or was she created by the monstrous world she inhabited? The narrative is more terrifying if we consider the latter. It suggests that the potential for such extreme violence lies dormant within the structures of profound injustice. The antebellum South was a society built on a foundation of casual, systemic brutality. The violence inflicted daily upon the enslaved population was the accepted bedrock of their economy and way of life. The absolute authority of the patriarch over his wife and children was enshrined in law and custom. In this context, Evangeline's act can be seen as a horrifying reflection, a twisted mirror image of the world that shaped her. Her father and her husband practiced a civilized brutality, economic, social, and physical, all within the accepted rules of their society. Evangeline's response was to reject their rules entirely and answer with an uncivilized, absolute brutality of her own. She learned the language of violence from her masters and turned it back upon them with an apocalyptic fury. This does not excuse her actions, but it contextualizes them within a world that was already steeped in unimaginable cruelty. She became the ultimate expression of the poison that was already present, the latent sickness of the society itself, made manifest in the body of a beautiful young bride. Her massacre was the fever that finally broke, a symptom of a disease that had been festering for generations. The true horror of the story is not that one woman was capable of such an act, but that she lived in a world that made such an act seem, to her, like a logical and necessary solution. The absence of a body is what elevates a crime story into a lasting myth. Evangeline Beaumont's vanishing act was her final, and perhaps most brilliant, maneuver. By disappearing, she denied the world a resolution. There was no capture, no trial, no confession, no execution. There was no body to bury, no grave to mark. She simply ceased to be, leaving a vacuum that could only be filled with speculation and fear. This unresolved ending is what has allowed her legend to grow and mutate over time. She became a canvas onto which the fears and anxieties of subsequent generations could be projected. For some, she is a feminist icon, a woman who reclaimed her agency in the most extreme way imaginable. For others, she is a demonic villain, the personification of pure, motiveless evil. For yet others, she is a tragic, romantic figure, a woman driven mad by love and loss. Her true self, her real thoughts and feelings are lost to history as irretrievable as her physical body. This ambiguity is the source of her power. She is not a historical figure but a specter, a ghost that haunts the dark corners of Southern history. Did she find peace in a new life in the North, or did she meet a lonely end in the Alabama swamps? Did she ever feel remorse for her actions, or did she die content in the knowledge of her absolute fiery revenge? We will never know. And that is precisely as she would have wanted it. Her final act was to transform herself from a woman of flesh and blood into an unkillable idea, a forbidden, macabre story that would be whispered in the dark for centuries to come, ensuring that her name and her terrible deed would never truly be forgotten. In the years that followed the Blackwood Fire, a strange and macabre tradition emerged in the local area. Young women who felt trapped, who were being forced into unhappy marriages, or who felt powerless in their lives, would make a secret pilgrimage to the edge of the swamp where the Beaumont land began. They would leave a small, simple offering at the base of an ancient, moss-draped cypress tree, a single white flower, often a magnolia or a gardenia. It was a quiet, desperate prayer to the spirit of the ash bride. They were not asking for her to commit murder on their behalf. They were asking for a fraction of her strength, her resolve, her terrifying courage to defy her fate. It was a forbidden, silent sisterhood, a cult of the forgotten and the oppressed, with a mass murderer as their patron saint. This ritual highlights the enduring and deeply disturbing legacy of Evangeline Beaumont. She became a dark symbol of female rage and rebellion. Her story, though horrifying, contained a seductive kernel of empowerment for those who had none. It represented a total rejection of a world that offered them no good choices. The offerings at the cypress tree were a testament to the fact that while society had condemned and then tried to forget Evangeline, her story resonated with the secret, unspoken desperation of many. The tale of the bride who chose to burn her world down rather than be consumed by it became a dark beacon, a warning that even the most placid surfaces can hide a volcanic potential for destruction when subjected to enough pressure. The white flowers left at the edge of the cursed land were a reminder that the ghost of Evangeline Beaumont was more than just a campfire story. She was a symbol of a rage that had never truly been extinguished. The tale of Evangeline Beaumont and the Wedding Feast massacre exists in the shadowy space between history and myth. It is a story that defies easy categorization, a chilling blend of Southern Gothic horror, historical tragedy, and macabre folklore. It persists because it speaks to timeless and unsettling truths about the corrupting nature of absolute power, the explosive potential of suppressed rage, and the terrifying lengths a human soul will go to when stripped of all hope and agency. The image of the bride in her white dress, standing serene amidst a tableau of death and destruction, is a potent and enduringly creepy one. It inverts every symbol of hope and new beginnings, the wedding, the feast, the white gown, and transforms them into instruments of a horrifying end. It is a story that stays with you, that lingers in the back of your mind long after you've heard it, making you look twice at the quiet, unassuming people in the world and wonder what dark gardens they might be tending in the secret corners of their hearts. Was she a monster, a victim, a revolutionary? Perhaps she was all three. The only certainty is that on a foggy October day in 1852, the world of the Southern aristocracy, with all its opulence and cruelty, was brought to its knees by a single, quiet woman who decided she would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor that day has never truly been broken. It echoes down through the decades, a chilling, eternal reminder of the day a wedding feast became a funeral, and a plantation bride became the angel of death. Over a century and a half has passed. The world that created Evangeline Beaumont is gone, itself reduced to ash and memory by war and the slow march of time. The great cotton plantations are no more. The social order she railed against has crumbled. Yet her story survives, a stubborn, dark stain on the fabric of history. It serves as a final, macabre irony. The powerful men who died at her feast, the men who believed their names and legacies would be etched in stone for eternity, are now little more than a footnote in her tale. They are remembered only as her victims. It is Evangeline, the disposable daughter, the beautiful asset, who achieved a kind of terrifying immortality. Her name, not her father's or her husband's, is the one that is still whispered on dark nights. In her quest to erase her enemies, she inadvertently etched her own horrifying legend into the annals of forbidden lore. It is a chilling testament to the idea that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes, it is written by the ghosts they leave behind. The story of Blackwood Manor is a cold case that can never be solved, a mystery whose only witness is the silent, brooding Alabama swamp that may or may not hold her bones. It is a reminder that the most pristine surfaces can hide the deepest rot, and that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one you should fear the most. The Ash Bride remains at large, a phantom in the American Co. insidiousness, a permanent resident in the haunted house of our collective past. Ultimately, the tale leaves us with a lingering, profound sense of dread. It is the dread that comes from peering into a darkness from which there is no easy return. The story offers no comfort, no moral, no simple resolution. There is no hero to be found in the ashes of Blackwood Manor. There are only villains, victims, and the unsettling blur where one becomes the other. The fate of Evangeline Beaumont remains the story's final, chilling mystery. Did she live a long life, haunted by the dozens of ghosts she created? Or did she find a swift, violent end, a final, brutal piece of poetry to cap her short, tragic life? The legend provides no answer, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part. Her story does not end. It simply stops. It leaves us staring into the smoky abyss of the unknown, the same way her paralyzed victims stared at their own impending doom. The phantom of the plantation bride serves as a permanent, unsettling reminder that beneath the placid surface of history, there are untold stories of rage and retribution, of forbidden acts so dark they are intentionally erased, only to fester and grow in the shadows. And we are left to wonder how many other stories like hers are out there, buried in the cursed soil of the past, just waiting for the right conditions to be unearthed and to haunt us once more.